The European Union is a member of the G20 as the EU. If you add the AU as the 21st for the G21, you add 1.4 billion people to representation at that crucial event. That will change decisively the discussion, because 1.4 billion people are not at the table for finance right now, and they need to be. So my first recommendation is the G21. I love the G20. Add one seat, 1.4 billion people with the AU represented. Second, we need an order of magnitude change of development finance. The rich countries just borrowed $17 trillion for COVID. The poor countries, nothing. Because the rich countries can borrow at zero, and the poor countries pay 5 or 10% coupon rates or have no access at all. So the world exposed its grotesque inequality this past year and a half. Rich countries didn't say, we tighten our belts, why don't you? My country spent $7 trillion of emergency funding, not one penny for anybody else, by the way. $7 trillion, it didn't even cross the imagination of the US Congress to include a few crumbs for the rest of the world.
You know, I am that person who refuses to believe that the problems of Africa, of course we also have our problems, that many of the large-scale problems we have in Africa are caused by Africans. No, the problems Africans are facing are problems that have been brought down upon Africa by the people from the West. You know, for example, the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994, where the Hutu or the Tutsi, they were fighting each other, and around 1 million people died. Another one is the situation of the Congolese in the Congo. 10 million Congo people were killed by King Leopold, but they didn't say it was King Leopold. They say the civil wars in Africa, the coups that are going on, that are always going on in West Africa, these things are fueled by the West. You know, the West are pretentious, they pretend, but they are the ones who are very, very guilty. They are the ones who are causing problems in Africa. You know, when there is a problem and there is unsettlement and there is a lack of peace, these people find a way to permeate through our government, to permeate through our resources, and loot us as much as they want. Because where there is no unity, where there is no peace, there is no unity. And where there is no unity, it's easier to break in. So I want us to continue watching this video by this professor of economics, where he's going to share more about how the West is exploiting Africa and then turning back around and saying Africa is the problem of Africa. Africans, it's not our own problems, sorry. These problems are brought upon us by the West. So let's have a listen. I'll give you my thoughts towards the end of the video.
World food system. It's based on large multinational companies. It's based on private profits. It's based on a very, very low measure of international transfers to help poor people, sometimes none at all. It's based on extreme irresponsibility of powerful countries with regard to the environment. And it's based on a radical denial of rights of poor people, as we just heard. It's interesting, we heard from the Minister of DRC, what's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years. And then Glencore and others now suck out your cobalt without giving you tax income. We don't reflect on that. We say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you govern properly? And so we have a system, but we need a different system. We cannot turn this over to the private sector. We already did about 100 years ago. Not only to the private sector with the U.S. military behind it, with the defense of these property rights in the minister of Honduras's country, where United Fruit ran the country for a long time. And their attorney was the foreign minister of the United States, Secretary Dulles, and his brother was the head of the CIA and overthrew the next door neighbor, Mr. Arbenz, to make sure that United Fruit could have its property. So we have a system, but we need a different system. And the different system has to be based on principles of human dignity in the Universal Declaration, principles of sovereignty, principles of economic rights, because these are not nice things to do. In 1948, all the government said that food is a right, social protection is a right, not a nice thing, not a pleasant thing, a right. That was 73 years ago. The SDGs are nothing more than our generation's attempt to honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I come from a country that not only doesn't care about the world's poor, it doesn't even care about its own poor. 1 in 7 Americans is hungry right now. And they don't care. I mean, the poor people care, but one political party, all it cares about is cutting taxes for the rich and filibustering any solution. So we're in a world that's really tough. The private sector is not going to solve this problem. I'm sorry to say to all of the private sector leaders, behave, pay your taxes, follow the rules. That's what you should do. And what the governments should do is the following. They won't, but they should. First, the G20 should become the G21 by inviting systemically the chairperson of the African Union and the African Union to be the 21st country. The European Union is a member of the G20 as the EU. If you add the AU as the 21st for the G21, you add 1.4 billion people to representation at that crucial event. That will change decisively the discussion, because 1.4 billion people are not at the table for finance right now, and they need to be. So my first recommendation is the G21. I love the G20. Add one seat, 1.4 billion people with the AU represented. Second, we need an order of magnitude change of development finance. The rich countries just borrowed $17 trillion for COVID. The poor countries, nothing. Because the rich countries can borrow at 0, and the poor countries pay 5 or 10% coupon rates or have no access at all. So the world exposed its grotesque inequality this past year and a half. Rich countries didn't say, we tighten our belts, why don't you? My country spent $7 trillion of emergency funding, not one penny for anybody else, by the way. $7 trillion, it didn't even cross the imagination of the US Congress to include a few crumbs for the rest of the world. But the poor countries cannot borrow. That's what we should have heard from the World Bank. I didn't hear that from the World Bank. I didn't hear real numbers. Real numbers are in trillions right now because the world economy is 100 trillion a year. But we don't talk about real numbers. But my job, all I know in this world is long division. Divide by 100 trillion and then see whether you're talking about something real or not. So that's the second thing. We need massively to increase the lending and borrowing capacity of poor countries at near zero interest rates like the rich countries have. Then they could get something done. By the way, for COVID vaccines, what we really need is for the United States to sit down with China, with Russia, with the European Union and the UK one day around the table and allocate these vaccines rather than hoarding them. That's all it would take. And then we're going to have national pathways. This is a wonderful idea, but they're going to need financing. And so everything that I've been saying, I know the numbers. That's all I do for 40 years is add up what's missing. You want electricity? It has to be purchased. You want digital access? It has to be purchased. You want safe water irrigation? It has to be purchased. This is what I do for a living, is add up these numbers and then find out that then somebody makes up something and names 1/100th of what's really needed. It's not even hard. By the way, the IMF has done wonderful studies in the last 2 years showing that we have a financing gap of about $400 to $500 billion a year for the basics for the SDGs. They show the gap, but nobody comes up with the number, the solution, which wouldn't be so hard because that's just not a big number. It's 0.5 of 1% of world output. So if we really care, we wouldn't have the G7 saying, we love education, therefore we're going to give $3 billion for education. That's what they said at the summit. But what UNESCO has shown is that you need at least $30 billion a year, minimum. But nobody looks at numbers. They just make up nice check the box. So we need the real numbers of finance to back the national pathways. The final thing is we need the UN as the core and central institution of this world, period. Because this is the only way we're going to have a civilized world, is a strong UN. And it cannot be that the whole UN budget is less than my neighborhood's budget in New York. The UN core budget this year is $3 billion. New York City's budget is $100 billion. And then we say, why don't things work well? Because the rich are hoarding everything. Final point, rather than our 3 billionaires going in space, well, they could go into space and stay there and leave their money behind. That would be one idea. But another idea is we have 2,775 billionaires on the current list. Their combined net worth, 2,700, is $13.1 trillion. Now, I have it on good authority, you don't need more than $1 billion to be comfortable. But they have an excess of $11 trillion over just the $1 billion. So we should be taxing that and having a civilized world. Thank you.
Jeffrey Sachs.
This man, Jeffrey Sachs, who is a world-renowned economist, was speaking about the development of Africa and the pretentious efforts that the West are trying to make to Africa. You know, they are causing bad things happening in Africa, and then they're placing the blame that Africans, we have weak governance, Africans, we are full of this and that, but that's not true. One of the points that he gave, he talked about the world, how during COVID-19, you know, many countries in the world were borrowing money, and the rich countries would borrow money from the IMF or the World Bank, whichever place they borrow the money, with 0% interest. You know, 0% is when you took the money as $1 billion US, you return the money as $1 billion US. But for the poor African countries, when they borrowed any amount of money, say $1 billion US, they would return it with a 5 to 10% interest. Why is this? Why is the person who cannot even pay an interest being forced to pay the interest, while the rich country which has the capabilities of paying the interest cannot pay the interest? And this person also, he talked about the introduction of the African Union into the G20 Now it will become the G21. And this, I find it very, very powerful and very interesting. You know, the UN has made itself a place where we have veto powers. I personally think we don't need veto powers. I always say power should not be concentrated on the hands of a few. Bad things would happen. Remember what happened with Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was an example of why power should not be concentrated in the hands of a single person. You know what he did? He did very nasty things. Even here in Africa, he did very, very nasty things. So Henry Sachs spoke against this. The African Union should be introduced into the G20. Now it will be called the G21, but not the G20. You know, introduction of the African Union into the G20, or rather the G21, would make Africans' voices be heard. Before, Africans, we were just receiving commands. We were not making any laws. We were just people who were told what to do. We were not there to produce efforts, to produce constitution, to make the UN constitution. We were just there listening. So there's so much he said about Africa, and it's very interesting that a white person is speaking such powerful words encouraging Africans. So yeah, it's a very good thing that we are able to learn and appreciate that we have people like Jeffrey Sachs who are able to speak on the voice of Africans. You know, he understands that the UN is the power that can bring justice to the world, according to Jeffrey Sachs, because the UN is the world government. The UN has the power of bringing together different governments together. For example, we have the European Union, which is a collective of the different governments in Europe together. We have the African Union, we have the NATO, we have the ones in Asia. We have all that. The UN brings them together, and they find a solution to bring peace to the world, to develop the world. He also added that there should be a bigger budget. The budget should be increased for the UN, because when there is a small budget, or rather when there's a big budget, implementation becomes easier. This means that the world should invest in UN, and when the world invests in UN, the UN also invests in Africa, because one of the places where we have too much of the UN people is Africa, because we really do need the UN's help. The UN is the peacekeeping forces. It provides food. It has many branches: UNHCR, UNICEF, the science and cultural thing, the environment thing. There's so many branches. This is why it's important that we have one government, and the government becomes the UN. I know it's a thing that many Africans would not agree with, because even Africans themselves, they didn't want the African Union, the Organization of African Union. They were so much against it. Remember when Kwame Nkrumah and Haile Selassie made a meeting in Addis Ababa. We have the Casablanca group and we have the Monrovia group. One people were for the unification of Africa, and other people were no, it's not time, it's too early for the unification of Africa. So they didn't want Africa to be a one-state country, having one currency, having a borderless policy. They didn't want that, because they had their own selfish interest, and they thought being a collective would hinder them from achieving this. Or maybe if they are greedy or they are dictators, the AU will find a way to suppress their greediness and their dictatorship. So another thing is, the government of the world should look onto the problems of Africa. You know, someone should not just come here and start wars and then just walk away and then pretend like, hey, why are they fighting? You see, we are fighting because you made us fight, and now you are going away. You made us fight because you found something very interesting in my country, in our country, and then you want to loot it. At the time when we are focused on fighting each other in civil wars, you've divided our attention, you have diverted our attention. You are here digging our gold, digging our cobalt, digging our diamond. That's the problem that was happening in the DRC. That is the problem that has been happening in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. I love these three countries for the stance they took against imperialism. in short, what Jeffrey Sachs is saying is that it's time we end Western imperialism. It's time it ends, and it ends with the power and the coordination of African leaders. These African leaders are the ones who are suppressing the Africans because they are remotely controlled. They are puppets. There's no any other name. They're just puppets, and the puppeteer is somewhere else, injecting them with US dollars. You know, so I'm thinking we should have a stance. The UN really can bring a solution to the problems we are having, because they'll be held accountable. Henry Kissinger was never held accountable for what he did. He thought, or maybe the government of the USA covered him because he was somebody, a general, a big person in the US government. But no, this time Africans, we lead in our own way and our own style. Congratulations to the people of Burkina Faso. Congratulations to the people of Mali. Congratulations to the people of Niger. You people have really set a good examples for other Africans. And so, thank you so much for watching the video. I have not much to say, but to educate you, stay African, be African. Yeah. So see you in the next video where we'll have another critical analysis. Yeah. So support the channel by subscribing, support me on Patreon, share the video to spread awareness, and thank you. See you in the next one.